Welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts series, Artists in Conversation. I'm Courtney J. Martin, the Paul Mellon Director of the Yale Center for British Art, and I am beyond pleased to welcome Jane Saville and Skarlet Smatana to our program tonight. Let's first start by acknowledging where we are. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Chicago, Golden Hill, Pawgasset, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded the land and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people, these nations, and this land. Jane Saville is a contemporary British artist known for her large-scale paintings. Saville was born in 1970 in Cambridge and became captivated at a young age by the imperfections of the flesh, with all its societal implications and taboos. In 1994, while on a fellowship in Connecticut, Saville observed a New York City plastic surgeon at work. Studying the reconstruction of human flesh was formative in her perception of the body, its resilience as well as its fragility. She read medical pathology textbooks, viewed cadavers, examined animals in meat, studied classical and Renaissance sculpture, and observed intertwined couples, mothers with their children, and individuals whose bodies challenged gender binaries. Through her practice, Saville reinvigorated contemporary figurative painting by expanding the limits of the genre and raising questions about society's perception of the body and its potential. Her work reveals a deep awareness, both intellectual and sensory, of how the body has been represented over time and across cultures. Currently, she lives and works in Oxford, England. I'm going to take a break for just a second because we have a lot of people coming. Come down close, get cozy. We have lots of space, particularly right over here. And I will say that for those of you who do come closer, you are rewarded for it because you get to see and hear things far better than you do when you are far away. So please, come down. Skarlet Smatana is director of the George Economou Collection in Athens, Greece. Over the last decade, she has deftly led its exhibition program and helped to expand its holdings of post-war and contemporary art. She frequently collaborates with public institutions and private foundations to create new opportunities for the public to engage with art, both in Greece and abroad. And she partners with philanthropic and lending initiatives to support contemporary art and artists. She's organized numerous solo exhibitions of artists, including a beautiful focus show of Saville's work in 2018 in Athens. Before joining the Economou Collection, Smatana worked at the Pace Gallery in New York, the Peggy Guggenheim Collection in Venice, the Richard Gray Gallery in Chicago, and served as director of L&M Arts in New York. Please join me in welcoming Jenny and Skarlet.
Thank you, Courtney. Jenny, we've known each other a long time, and I'd like to thank you for sitting here with us today for a conversation on your illustrious career. As Courtney mentioned in her introduction, you were born in Cambridge in 1970, and from an early age, you were taken under the wing of your uncle, Paul Saville, who was a great inspiration for you and a mentor on being an artist and how it can be a way of life. How did this approach help guide you, and were there foundational lessons that helped shape you early on?
Well, really from about the age of 8, something like that. I think my father had seen my drawings and said, you know, we should show my uncle who was teaching in Oxford. And he sort of took me under his wing. I'd go at school holidays. I would go on trips with him, go and see Rembrandt, go to Venice, even go to sort of fishing villages and draw fishing boats, which really wasn't my favorite thing to do, especially in the British weather. But, you know, I had to do a lot of those things. And in between seeing him, I would work on drawings at home. I'd get my friends to model. And that just built up a folio. It built up a relationship about art with my uncle. And really, I mean, if we would go to Amsterdam to look at Rembrandt, for example, we didn't just look at Rembrandt. He would take me to the bar where Rembrandt would drink. He would take me to we'd stand at the bridge where Rembrandt, you know, looking at the bridge Rembrandt drew. So the gift he gave me, looking back, was not just art as a way of life, but the life of the artist. So it wasn't an unobtainable thing. It wasn't something that was just about art history. It was actually, you know, we'd look at the models that were in Tintoretto paintings and see the same, you know, the same model that was used in this painting was also used in this painting. So it wasn't a dry experience. It was very much a working experience. So, and when we were in Venice, we would get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, take the vaporetta, which is a water boat, and go and draw at the fish market. So, and he sometimes would, I mean, it wasn't necessarily a pretty picture. He wasn't gentle with me. I mean, actually, he'd hit my hand if I doubled my line. So if I was drawing and I went back in an indecisive way, I could feel this hand coming down, and he would, you know, literally sort of be aggressive. So it wasn't you know, nowadays you would never do that with you know, a young person. But I was his dog's body, so we would, you know, be going on this art history trip, and I would be counting people on the bus, carrying suitcases, and in return I got to absorb this incredible art history at a young age, and use all the materials and be like a young artist almost, or an artist apprentice even, I would say. So that was the sort of gift he gave me.
Ah, it's so special. This introduction of Venice that he gave you, he set that bar to the old masters with Tintoretto and Titian, and in this grand scale. And you've been quoted as saying about your uncle that he said, if you have heroes, make them very great.
Yeah, I mean, he did, and the artists I like are the sort of what is seen as the great artists, which some people can see as problematic, but it's been, I just tend to find that kind of magnet with that sort of artist. You know, artists that have utterly dedicated themselves to making this work. I mean, I've read the letters of Michelangelo, and you know, the artists I like are the sort of traditional greats, really. I go back to them. They're part of the, you know, Picasso, Degas, Michelangelo, Bacon, Freud, de Kooning. They're the sort of team that never leave me, and I'm in constant conversation with them in my studio. So I make my work in dialogue with the sort of greats from art history. And also I like to learn about their lives. I live this very simple life, like monastic almost, where I just go to the studio every day and just try and push this pictorial knowledge I've developed of ways of making paintings. And so I like to learn about the sort of dedication, because I feel close to those people because of that level of dedication.
And well, this happened even so early on in your life. And like, for example, we have propped on the screen here, which was 7 feet. And this was in your degree show.
Right.
So,
I mean, I know you've said to me this is a very big painting, but you've got to remember the context of the time that I was at art school. I mean, we were looking at Kiefer. Kiefer was putting aeroplane wings on canvases. I mean, this was a miniature compared to a Kiefer. So it didn't feel that big at the time. But I was definitely very sort of purposeful, I would say. I'd been to America for a scholarship. I'd learnt this feminist theory, which really blew me apart because my training was very academic. And the art I liked, I mean, I liked Titian, I liked Freud, Bacon, Velázquez, you know, those very traditional figure paintings. And then when I went to Cincinnati, I happened to fall upon this gender studies department, and it just changed my life. And for 2 reasons. One, it was to do with the theory that I was learning, and also it explained to me a patriarchal system. And I don't think I would have survived in the art world without learning that system. Because when things go wrong, you get bad reviews, or just the way the system works. I've been able to sustain my thinking because of knowing that system. So it's the advice I always give people, to learn the way things work in society so that you feel strong through it when the going gets rough, actually.
Propped, this was in the degree show, as we had mentioned, and now, interestingly, it's the highest price paid at auction for a living woman artist. And not many people really know about the actual events that took place surrounding your degree show, or when that actually happened in Glasgow. Would you describe what was happening?
So the degree show in Glasgow was 4 years long, and in the 3rd year I'd spent most of that in America. So I was in Cincinnati University, which when I got that scholarship to go there, I mean, my intention was to just go to New York. I actually didn't realize how far Ohio was from New York. So, you know, on a map, it looks quite small, but I didn't actually realize the vastness of America. So I did make it to New York, and I did see de Kooning, and I saw Pollock and Rothko and all of the, and I went to Washington, D.C., and traveled around America. I went to New Orleans. So it wasn't just being in Cincinnati and that, and learning about feminist theory. But I took all of that back to Glasgow, which was even though it's an international college, there's a slightly sort of European-based parochial look at painting. So I'd learned all of these, my world had changed. I had a much more international outlook. And then I came back with, when I say burdened with theory, it wasn't a bad thing, but it was difficult to deal with as a painter of the figure. That I like painting naked bodies, that painted in a sort of school of Freud to some degree, or Bacon, that School of London, with this theory where all the other artists that I was reading about, none of them were painters. So it was photographers like Cindy Sherman, Helen Chadwick, artists that had dealt with the less kind of tradition-laden history of painting. So for a while, I stopped painting, and I felt absolutely dreadful. I tried to make photographs, I made casts with plaster. I tried to make things that looked like contemporary feminist art of the people I was interested in. And it just didn't work for me. I felt like homesick. It's the only way I can describe it. I thought, this language that's mine, I can't use it. So I thought I just have to find a way to navigate this. So I started making these figurative paintings of my own body. I used wax at one point on top of the paint, so I could carve into the paint. And I made a painting before this called Branded, where I used, my thesis was on tracing the notions of femininity through Western philosophy. I mean, I did a ridiculous amount of research for my thesis. It was more like a PhD thesis, but it gave me this backbone for my work. And I came across a group called Écriture Féminine, which were this group of French feminist writers who were trying to write the woman. So it was against this a kind of phallic system of a patriarchal order, and a way to try and find a language to talk about being female. And so I thought, well, how would that look in art? How does that look in a visual system?
Exactly.
So this painting, Propped, was my attempt at almost critiquing my position. I knew I couldn't visualize it, so I just painted out what I couldn't do. And I learned this lesson, which was that working on something you can't do is a language in itself. So it became very powerful that I just literally made what I couldn't do, and that became my visual language. So, and the text on the piece says, if we continue to speak in this sameness, speak as men have spoken for centuries, we will fail each other. Again, words will pass through our bodies, above our heads, disappear, make us disappear. And the text is written backwards on the painting. And when I first showed the painting, it was shown with a mirror, which is exactly the same size as the painting, 9 feet from the painting, which was the height of the painting. So in order to experience the painting, you had to go into this system of judgment, which was the space between the mirror and the painting. So you read the text in a conventional narrative sense. You also saw your own body and your body in this system of looking. And I think once I've used the mirror again, but I've done a few text pieces, but after a while I realized that system was an equation that didn't really work for me. Everything was right. I agreed with what was being said. I liked my painting, but it was such a sort of fixed system using language for me that I decided I had to try and do it in paint itself. So I developed other models after that. So in terms of a kind of career thing, I was extremely lucky that my graduation show, the Times newspaper was doing an article about students who had graduated that year. And I was very lucky that the picture editor of the Times really liked my work, and he put it on the front cover, this big. The whole front cover of the newspaper was my painting. When I went to the newsagent to see, oh, I think I'm in there, and I was expecting a kind of postage stamp inside, on page 25, and it was actually on the front cover. So, and then he commissioned a painting, the picture editor of the Times, And a few days later, I went to my studio space and I had a post-it on the studio space and it said, "Call Charles Saatchi," with a number. And everybody else in the studio was looking at me like they hated me because he was the coolest collector at that time. He had the most beautiful space I've actually still ever shown in, because it's this cavernous, wonderful space. I thought it was a joke at first. I thought somebody had done it as, like winding me up. And I called up and it was true. And he said, "Would you come to London? Can I show you this space? Come down to London." So I flew down to London a few days later. And he stood in the space and he said, "This space is yours, you can make whatever you like. I'll give you some money and do whatever you want." And, I was standing there going, this is the space I've seen Richard Serra, Cy Twombly, why do I'm 21 years old, what are you doing? And he said, I saw your work, I've seen 2 paintings, I bought the paintings from your degree show, not directly for me, that I'd sold them for very little money to other people who made a lot of money because he bought them from them. And then I was going to do an MA and MFA, and I just said, okay, I'll do my MFA after I've done this show. And I went in a room and I didn't come out basically for 2 years. And I made a body of work which became the YBA 3 in London. And that was an incredible act of faith.
Incredible.
And something in me, I didn't even tell my family that I was doing that show. I just thought, I have to just get down to work. This is something in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I just made the best work I could from then on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really was a big moment.
Yeah, it was an incredible, I still don't understand that act of faith. But I wasn't afraid. I didn't feel intimidated.
Mm-hmm.
I had such this incredible sense of purpose at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I just knew it was like a moment that I had to take. So I made this 21-foot triptych, which is now in the Broad Foundation. Trace I made for that show. A series of works, plus it had these works in that show. I thought, okay, I won't go back to college now. And I just started working.
Well, he bought a lot of those works back from those that acquired them from your degree show, or at least 3.
So a lot of people think that he bought them from me at my degree show.
Mm-hmm.
That's not the case.
Right.
He bought them, I sold them at my degree show, then he saw my work a few days later, and then he went round buying them up. So I don't know how much he bought them for, but I met somebody and she said, "Oh, it's great, I've paid off my mortgage and I'm going traveling around the world," so it must have been significant.
Oh my goodness. Well, you were saying that you felt so much purpose at the time. And of course, by this point, you're very well versed in feminist theory. And you have this quote in The Observer that you say, "I'm painting these kinds of figures because I think it's important to challenge traditional representations of the female nude. The fleshiness of women's bodies is something that is never put on display in the 20th century. It's always airbrushed or suppressed. I'm trying to do it with a certain sympathy and emotion, and also put it in the context of feminist thought." So we've discussed about feminist theory, and this pushed you into an exploration of plastic and cosmetic surgery. So how did that evolve?
So when I was making these, I also started I was in a mode of doing an awful lot of research. So it's almost impossible for us to imagine now, but at that time there was no mobile phone, no internet. The way that you would find out about anything unusual, you relied on art magazines, you had to go to libraries, you had to go to unusual bookshops. I mean, I would scour medical bookshops. There was one in Gower Street in London, in the basement. And, they were very expensive. They were, at that time, about £250, which probably now is, equivalent of £600. Mm-hmm. And they might have 2 or 3 illustrations. I might think, okay, I can do something with this. So research became an important part of my work. I used to spend a lot of time on it, going to medical libraries, those sorts of things, building up my knowledge. And I fell upon this kind of mark making that surgery used to remove fat from women's bodies. And I made a painting called Plan, which had these target marks on, which reminded me of the mappings on contour maps. And so it was, and also, kind of primal carvings, those sorts of things in rock carvings. It had a lot of, instead of having text which you read, it had a kind of symbolism inherent within this target. And so that set me off on a research of surgery. And then after I'd done the Saatchi collection, I had a residency program here in Connecticut, actually, in Bantam, Connecticut. And the collector it was a wonderful couple. And I actually saw a photograph of her when I got there, and her face looked quite different from the way it looked that day. So I thought, I wonder if she's had any surgery. And so I asked her, and she was very open, and she said, yes, would you like to meet my surgeon? And I think she thought I wanted something done for myself. So within a few days, I was actually in a surgery in New York. And he said, if you want to do this, why don't you go to the medical library, and I'll get you a pass to go like a student.
This was Barry?
Yeah,
Barry Weintraub.
Mm-hmm. And so I would go to 102nd Street and go and study there. I'd see surgery in the morning and then go and study in the afternoon. And so I would sit there with these books and see incredible images of surgery, and I came across this technique called Rubens flap. And I thought, this is like the best title I've ever found in my life. And so it was made, it was like, this is just made for a painting. So, and I could see all this transition of flesh from one part of a body to another. And at the same time, I was reading people like Julia Kristeva, who'd written a book called The Powers of Horror about objection. So, and she was talking about I was looking at Helen Chadwick's work, where she had this beautiful piece of golden hair knotted with pig's intestines, like plaited. And it was the placement of something like a woman's golden hair is admired when it's on her head, but you put it somewhere else and it becomes an abject, kind of monstrous female. And so I started to play with that with flesh, like moving flesh around, putting flesh from a different part of a body somewhere else. Mm-hmm. And by being in the surgery and seeing a surgeon actually working with human flesh, there was a switch in my thinking from seeing the anatomy of a body to thinking about the anatomy of a painting. There was a major like change of mode in my thinking. So, and that started me thinking, okay, instead of just constantly putting paint on top, how does this paint work? And I started to move from stains all the way up to very thick impasto. And so, but I don't think I'd have got that way of thinking without seeing the surgery, because just the layers of fat, the structure underneath, just suddenly I thought that took that model and put it into painting.
Exactly. I mean, didn't de Kooning say that oil paint was made for flesh?
Oil paint's the reason. No, flesh is the reason
exactly.
oil paint was invented. Yeah.
Yeah. So around 96 or 97, you agreed with Larry Gagosian for a show in New York, mm-hmm. which would take place then in the fall of 1999. And that show was Territories. Mm-hmm. And so there were 6 colossal paintings then. One of them was this one, Rubens Flap, and then Fulcrum, which I think could compete with Kiefer at 16 feet long, 8.5 high. And that's still one of the most significant in scale paintings that you've done to date. The works sell out prior to the exhibition, and the American critics receive it really well. And in our conversations, you've described New York as a place where you go to cut your cloth.
Yeah. I mean, it was from the moment I went, when I was growing up, you wanted to go to Paris because that's where Giacometti was, basically, or Picasso worked there, or, that when you're British, it's, the nearest place where art had been made that was just so great. And then you learn a little bit more about art and you realize, oh, no, it's actually New York. There's all this incredible art in New York. And I'd seen de Kooning's Easter Monday in the Met.
Yeah.
And it was a shocking experience to see something so great that was not a figure, because I loved figurative painting. So, being in New York, understanding how the New York art world was and all these galleries, it was very exciting. I just wanted to show in New York. So when Larry asked me, I put everything into that show. I mean, it was brutal, the amount of hours I worked on that show, and just the tension of getting the realism on that scale into those bodies. Hopefully when you look at a painting like Fulcrum, you feel that the reality is embodied in the work, but to get that level of bodies working like that was brutal. My ability and my ambition didn't match at that time. And I actually I had a kind of decisive moment. I was working on that piece, and you know, this is a 2-year kind of body of working every day, every night. You know, I had no money, not really any money at that time. I spent everything on this enormous studio that was underheated, and I just couldn't do anything. And I went into my kitchen and I smashed my hand on the wall of the kitchen, and I said, I cannot do this. And my hand went black. I was looking at it and I went, well, that was really clever. Yeah. Because that's the only thing that's going to get you this show finished. And I thought, you cannot get angry again. You can never get cross about this. You have to just work at this to get better. It was like a turning point and I've never since then, I've channeled, I get this destructive thing welling up in me when I've worked for a while. And after that moment, I would go for a walk when I felt like that. Now, I actually work through it because I've learned this way to channel it. So I do certain works when I feel like that, or certain starts to painting. So I've learned to utilize all these parts of my personality that can have hyper concentration for painting eyes or some teeth or something like that. And then other times when I'm more destructive, I use to create abstract areas in the paint by putting the painting on the floor. So I've sort of learned to harness my personality, I would say. That's been a beneficial movement. But it all came from smashing my hand on a wall one day over fulcrum and realizing that I was actually quite embarrassed about what I'd done because I'd literally done something so destructive that I could have just destroyed my show. And, you know, it was okay. It was okay in the end.
Well, you never did it again.
I didn't. Not yet. I mean, there's always the left arm.
Well, this is fulcrum.
I mean, those sections of paint, all the knee coming out of the bottom figure. I mean, you know, anatomically, on that scale, it was very difficult to make that really hold together. And at that time, I was looking at Cindy Sherman a lot. She was a big influence, actually. She opened a lot of doors for me in terms of she wore these sort of fantasies of traditional femininity, of ways to be a woman. And instead of it there being a truth, like I was looking for this one way, and she had multiple ways. And none of them were the truth. They were all types of truths or all lies, you know, just myths of femininity. So I created these sections of bodies. So often in work, I try to use a heightened sense of artifice mixed with reality. And those things together, for me, the really, really good artists in art history have used contradiction. It's at the heart of all the great work. Whether it's Michelangelo, whether it's Bacon, it's, you know, if you take Michelangelo, he'll have this rough stone with very polished stone. He'll have, if you look at a sculpture like Moses, he'll have this muscular armature that looks like the body of an 18-year-old guy with this big beard. And it's subliminal. When you first start looking at it, you feel this enormous sense of humanity, and you can't work it out. And then when you really start to unravel it, you see that he employs this contradiction that sits together. And Bacon does it by using a flat ground and then the built-up areas of paint, so you concentrate this area of humanness. But it wouldn't be charged without the flat areas of colour, and that heightens it. So you can look through art history and you find this inherent contradiction. So I've tried to use that in my work.
So when you were working on this show and just prior to it, Glenn Luchford, you were doing these photographs together.
Yeah.
And there was this pressing of your naked body on plexiglass.
Right.
And so how did that inform the work in Territories? And I mean, not just the photography, but also the fact that there was a paragraph I was reading when you were saying that just even transporting in the train in New York, that experience of being pressed together with other people and that pressing of the bodies together. And here we have fulcrum of these three bodies horizontal together.
Well, I'd made a painting before this called Shift.
Right, Shift.
Which were bodies.
Yeah.
What I didn't want the edge of a body. So I started looking much more abstract painting, and I never wanted to make a narrative. So when you have, one of the hardest things to do is to have more than one figure. As soon as you have two figures, you have a conversation, or you have a narrative. And the only person I had seen who could manage that really was Bacon. Because, you know, and when you have narrative or storytelling, the best mode now is film. I mean, it's the best way to talk about those sort of storytelling and painting. But I wanted more than one figure. So I had to find ways of making multiple figures together without a narrative that was just there. And so having these bodies where you were unsure of where one started and one finished became a sort of landscape of flesh. And so I tried shift, which was a sort of curtain of flesh. And then this was a kind of mountainous. So it's a landscape as much as it's a figurative painting.
Absolutely. So in the same exhibition, there was this new depiction of an intersex model, Della Grace Volcano, self-described in the catalog as saying, I no longer identify as woman and feel uncomfortable being read as female. I'm intersex by design. An intentional mutation in need to have my gender specified as existing outside of the binary gender system rather than an abomination of it. So as a contemporary subject, you're well ahead of openly explored gender issues. This painting is 23 years old now. What were your motivations at the time?
So I was aware of Dell's work through my research of intersex bodies. I mean, the context of this work, I mean, when I made this painting and showed it, the majority of people said that body cannot possibly exist. You've made this body up. And so, because I found the research, it was actually through my research of surgery that I came across Dell's photography. And I met Dell in London. And at the time, Dell identified as a he. So I'm not exactly sure. I think he identifies as a herm now. I think that's, I'd have to check that actually. So if I make a mistake about pronouns, I apologize. But I said, are you Della Grace Volcano? And Dell said, are you Jenny Saville?
Right.
I said, I am. And I just said, would you model for me? And Dell said, yes. And so when Dell arrived, I'd actually put myself into the position that I wanted Dell to be and had myself photographed in Polaroids, which was based on a sculpture from the British Museum of the Parthenon sculpture of a sculpture called Iris. And I turned the sculpture on its side with this very big projecting leg. And so Dell agreed to model. And during the painting, I said, would you be prepared to write about your experience of being a model? Which actually was, I didn't realize that models actually had not really done that before. So Dell wrote about, I thought, I can't actually explain your position better than you can. I can just make the painting. So Dell wrote this really amazing piece. And the notion of being intersex by design was, Dell's body was a manifestation of the theory that I was interested in. And after the show, because I'd got used to people not really understanding my work, traditionalists would say, well, I like your work, but why do you ruin it by putting text on the top and graffitiing through it? And then I had a lot of people who were interested in feminist theory saying, how can you paint a naked female body or a naked body actually at all as a feminist? How can you work in this, traditional Western white male laden history? And I learned that if I'm annoying people, everybody, I must be doing something. That there's got to be a space I'm operating in if everybody's kind of annoyed about this. So I got used to that. And I got used to people not really understanding what I was doing. And then one day, the phone, after my show at Terraces had opened, I had a phone call with a person who looked after my work then called Molly, and she said, you've got to sit down because I've just got an article, and it was written by Linda Nochlin, and the title of the article was Floating in Gender Nirvana. And it was suddenly, there was this one person who had understood my work and had understood this notion of gender being fluid or potentially fluid, or what was the potential there in not being fixed with gender. Is this a free space? Is this a space where, that moves the borders around, where people have more freedom of a way to live or a way to see or a way to understand art? And so it was beautiful. It was a beautiful day to have, and I became a good friend of Linda. She wrote my catalogue, and from then until she died, I would have dinner with her, and it was a really good, fantastic relationship.
God, I mean, that is so rewarding. that shifting and that fluidness that you're talking about. So that becomes really gradually that becomes very apparent in your work. It becomes really quite developed, and whether it's technically shifting from figurative to the abstract, or a reference in time, or shifting realities in the pictorial form. So in this example, in Passage, this is a fluid gender in our contemporary realm, and it's rejecting these confines that we're talking about.
Right.
Are you searching for that visual language that will describe the realities that we currently live in?
Well, this piece in particular, two things kind of came together. One was I'm always searching for a body that speaks for the architecture of our time.
Yeah.
So, and this person's called Clara from Bogota, who I met near the railway station in Rome. And it was actually quite a complicated modelling, because I thought Clara was, living independently. And when she came, or she came to model, she came with her pimp and another model. And so it was a really difficult position, because the pimp was saying, you have to give me another 50 euros, another 50 euros. And if you don't, so I was caught in what is going on here? But Clara and I struck this kind of friendship up. And I liked the judgment of this incredibly sensual body. I mean, Clara had a massive dick and was really, very strong, sexy, sensual, and, powerful. And it challenged my whole judgment when you looked through Clara's body. And I found it exhilarating to paint this whole body that moved around. And at the same time as this, I also I'd been to de Kooning Studio, and I had this one amazing day at de Kooning Studio in the Hamptons on Long Island. That's the same thing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I spent this day there, and he only died a few years before, and I got to spend the day looking at how he made art. So I was like, okay, he uses two palettes, he's got these kind of brushes. I looked at the way he mixed his paint. I looked at the amount of paint he had. He had a massive amount of paint. And I thought, my God, if I make any money, I'm doing this. I'm going to try and have this kind of trunk full of paint, because you could see he had invested in himself. He'd invested in his ability to take risks, because he had the materials. He had multiple palettes each side of him. He had this hole in the floor where the painting, I'd struggled with going up and down ladders, making platforms to try and make the scale of my work. And that day, I shortcut 10 years of development that day, because I really could see, okay, this is a level of professionalism I'm not at. This is, what are you doing with those bowls? What are you doing with that? Why have you got those proportions of color? Oh, right, you make cards. That's how you keep recipe cards. That's such a good idea. And I was sort of, curiously looking at everything, and took that back to my studio, which was in Sicily at the time, and started this body of work using a higher range of color. I learned how to use tone plus pure color. And then in 2004, just around the time I was making this, I went to New York, and there was a big de Kooning show on West 24th Street. And Larry, my dealer, said, why don't you come over and just spend a few days as we're hanging the show? And I would get a coffee in the morning and just go from one painting to the other, looking at the work. And it was as intimate as it could possibly be, because normally you'd see a show at the Met, or, and you've got lots of people around you, and it's kind of a show. And this wasn't a show. These were the paintings coming out of boxes, leaning against the wall. Yeah. And as people were busying around, I just sat there and moved between them, and realized the pictorial development and spatial development he'd spent his life pursuing. And so this work came, in tandem with meeting Clara and the sort of movement through gender. So I was able to get those two things to hit together at that time.
It was quite an interesting year in 2004. So you acquired a house in Palermo around 2001, and then really started to spend time from 2004 onward in Palermo.
Right. And
shortly thereafter, you were pregnant with your first child, and this series of work comes about, the Stairheads.
So this is part of seeing that de Kooning show. I mean, I actually had I came back from that de Kooning show and I made a folder, this white folder, you know, like you have in an office or something, and it said April 2004. And it was like, I put the de Kooning paintings in it, I put close-ups of it, and it was like this Bible, and I was like, you cannot not address that show. Like, your painting has to deal with that because you feel so closely related to it. But obviously, I don't want to make a de Kooning painting. I want to do my painting, but I wanted to put in the things that I'd learned, that I'd seen. Mm-hmm. I mean, technical things like how to nudge tones, how to run colours through each other, the consistencies of paint, laying one tone on top of another tone, where you get this sort of double shadow shift. So he was using it in an abstract way, and I wanted to put it back into figuration. So these stairheads, I sort of set myself the target that when you're making a figurative painting, most of the journey of making the painting of the figure is learning about the figure, how that figure works, how to get that leg to work, how to get that knee to come out, whatever it is, how to get the turn of this wrist. And that occupies a lot of thinking during the journey of the painting. So I think Si's Battle of Lepanto was around at the same sort of time, right?
Yeah, that would have been 2001 that he made them.
Right, so I'd seen these just amazing, epic paintings, ambitious, abstract paintings that were about the materiality of paint. So this was just this I thought, if I make the same image again and again, I will get to this point where I'll know the image so well, I've taken that journey, I can go somewhere else. And it was a strategic move to try to learn more about painting. And it worked, actually. I mean, I can't say that I think the last stairhead I made is better than the first one, but I learned more that have gone into painting since that time. So, and also I had 2 children in 1 year, and anyone who's had children knows that your brain can't operate for a certain period of time at that moment. So the only thing I could do was to just keep painting the same thing. I mean, I've got a lot of stairheads.
How many?
Well, I don't know, like maybe 35 or something. Like I keep coming across them in my studio. I go, that's another study. Bloody hell, how many did I make? It was like the Van Gogh sunflower moment. It was kind of somewhat scary when I look back on it. But I was just doing this, I could draw that ear again and again exactly the same way. And, the whip that went round the white shirt. And I wanted that level of fluidity. I'd see de Kooning's kind of loose, his loose wrist that would make these, almost that the nature of paint and the nature in him were working in tandem. And I wanted to get that level of dexterity. So I learned how to paint on the floor, to take away my kind of judgment system, where you say, if you've made an area of a painting that's very nice, you'll never paint over it if it's upright. If the moment you put it on the ground, you just act like a child, and you just sort of go over the top, and it has this sense of gravity. So I kind of see gravity as a third arm. That's how, in my head, that's how I describe it, that it's this other arm that you can go to. So I work a lot between the floor and upright, and use these sense of gravities, whether it's drips when the paint is upright, or on the floor, where when you make a mark on the floor, it's a sort of resistance because gravity's holding the mark down. So when you put it upright, it's got a kind of floating fashion. And that, I found that very effective, and I've pretty much used that ever since.
You've said that it's a chance to be very abstract in these paintings.
Yeah.
It's that opportunity.
Yeah, very much. Yeah.
So we talked about your first son and then daughter shortly thereafter. So there's clearly a before and after,
right,
from 2007 with your work, and how you approached your work. So in this painting titled "The Mothers," it's a canonical theme, clearly in classical painting, though depicted by male artists. And so here we have a self-portrait of you with 2 unwieldy children. And
it's actually just my son in different positions.
Oh, great,
So
perfect.
it's actually my daughter's in my stomach and my son is everywhere else. So it came about of a few things. So when I was having my kids, I noticed that a lot of people were saying to me, well, your life's going to be so different now. You know, are you going to be able to have a career? Are you going to be able to do this? You know, it was a shock to me because there was no doubt I was going to do this, you know, but I mean, a lot of people would say your creativity goes down, I hear, when you know, when you have children, if you're female. And I mean, no, that really, it was, I had that several times.
And you had an explanation
you
for
know,
that.
I spent my life trying, you know, being a serious artist in an international arena, and suddenly there was the kind of level of sexism that I thought had gone. So, and I felt extraordinarily creative. So I was making these drawings of my son moving around, you know, this, you know, my body was just, it never looked better. I was like, I'm out here, like, you know, I've been mutating forms forever, and now I've totally mutated. It was exciting, you know, to see that. And then the images that I'd looked at, like Leonardo drawings that I loved, that I realized that actually I had a very insider view, rather than it being something that was going to stop me making work. I actually had this incredible, you know, I'd spent my whole life trying to paint flesh. And I was making flesh and painting flesh all at the same moment. It was this incredibly potent mix. And suddenly, you give birth. It's one of the most violent things you've ever seen in your life. And then there's this beautiful child that's in miniature that has these tiny little hands. You know, I couldn't believe this sort of living sculpture I'd created. And then they start moving and growing. Every day is something different. Every limb, you watch a child get in and out of a bath. It's like it's just magic. And I thought, I can't ignore this. It's the most potent thing that's ever happened in my life. I'm not going to not make work about this. And so I was, looking through art history of other images of mother and child, and in recent history, it's a very chocolate box, cutesy experience. And I was, coming to and from Sicily, looking at ancient myths, the hybridities of cultures through history in Sicily. And so these very ancient fertility goddesses kept coming up. And I was interested in the goddess Isis from Egypt and the kind of fertility cycles that this goddess represented. And I came across some writing that Goethe had done when he was in Sicily. And he'd read the same thing as me, which was called The Mysteries of Isis and Osiris, written by Plutarch. And he had written in the second part of Faust this incredible scene where Faust is sent to this place called the Realm of the Mothers. And the Realm of the Mothers is this, you should find the text, it's in the second part of Act 2 of Faust. And Faust has to go down or go up, they say descend or ascend, it's all the same, to this unbounded realm of forms where the mothers, the realm, which is the realm of the mothers, and it's a place of creativity outside of time and place. And I just thought, there's this wonderful line, it said, I stand and around me circles time. And it was a kind of shock to read this text, that it embodied the kind of ancestral tie of what I'd seen in an umbilical cord and what that meant for human history. That it was a key, it unlocked these feelings, these sort of ancestral shudder of what it is to have a child. That I just couldn't stop making work. I was making drawings, and the mothers came out of that. It was this kind of whirling of creativity, which was the utter opposite of what socially the notion was of a mother in contemporary world that I was living. So I had to look to the ancient world to sort of unlock the feelings or find representations of how I felt. And that's how that body of work came out. So, I'd read a poem by Wilkie as well, which said, and one sees to the bottom of time. And I thought, well, how would that look? Painting is really a repository of time. That's what it doesn't matter what kind of painting you make, whether you make, like a Mondrian, whether you make a very complicated figure painting that takes months, whatever it is a repository of time that is just a collection of memory of whoever's made it. And it's not like music or film or a book, which has a narrative in the sense of a beginning and an end, and you run through it, however avant-garde that piece is. But with a painting, you experience all of that all at the same time. So that journey is basically, you're aware that the journey is there, and I use different techniques to try to extend the looking of that journey in the finished piece. But it is, you experience it all at once. So I was interested in that, how to extend time. So in the mothers, I started using stencils where you could see through the body. And I wouldn't have thought like that had I not had a body inside my own flesh, because I thought about the notion of reproduction, what was going on. So the maternal made me creative, which was, for someone who'd sort of grown up as this feminist who believed against biology, I didn't want to be defined by my biology. Actually, my biological potential created a possibility as a feminist, which was a change.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it was extraordinary. It was a shock to think
Absolutely.
that what was seen as a traditional way of being a female actually became the most empowering.
Yeah, it's incredibly empowering.
Yeah. I think it was an attitude as well. You know, it was a sort of, I've learned that myths are just bullshit.
Yeah.
They're literally there to just,
Right.
if you have a prejudice against you in any way, the only way to move that prejudice is to just do it. If you want to make work, if you make that work exist, that's all that matters. It will find a place. You know, so
Exactly.
the most important
You just have
thing
to trust that, I think.
is to actually make the work exist. Just visualize it, bring it into being. And then, and it actually can shock you. You can change your position too.
Exactly.
So I just always just go back to work. That's my answer to everything.
Right. I completely agree. A moment ago, you were saying a repository of time. This is your first depiction of a contemporary conflict, this painting titled Aleppo, Syrian civil war and the impact on civilians. There's a sculptural likening to the cradled bodies of Pieta.
Right.
Can we discuss a little bit about your influence of Renaissance sculpture and Michelangelo?
So, I mean, he's probably the artist that has guided me most. I mean, he's in my early prop paintings, and I kind of drift away and then come back. And also his utter dedication to a figurative form, and I'm a sculptural painter. You know, I like to build form in paint. I mean, I work in 2 dimensions, but I'm thinking in 3 dimensions. And especially now in my drawings, when I kind of make these cross-hatching marks, I think I'm sculpting. And if you work the paper or the surface enough, it becomes like sculpture. So this piece comes out of the big pietas that Michelangelo has done, where he, you know, when you look at them, they've got this incredible torque. Inside every single sculpture is this twist within it, where he builds, and he uses every potential that a human body can have to create heightened levels of emotion. It could be a hand pushed here, and then another arm here. And the whole body has this twist. And none of it would happen in real life if you really unlock it. That body cannot operate in that way, and yet it's utterly believable. So I started to look at that and thought, well, this notion of a human mass, and it became a natural way to work, to build form. So I actually started this piece with these enormous drips. So it's made on raw canvas, and I started on the floor, and I started with for the last, I would say, maybe decade or so, I've used weather as the starting point of my work. So you know, when you come out of your house in the morning and you go, okay, it's foggy, or okay, it's a beautiful day, or it's like it sets the tone of the emotion that you feel. And I once got this Japanese chair delivered to my house, and it was so beautifully wrapped up, this Japanese chair. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. The box it came in was beautiful. The wrapping was beautiful. Underneath the chair was really considered. And I just sat there with this box, and I thought, I'm never going to make art the same way again after this, because there's it was just, everything was so thoughtful, and nothing was just kind of, okay, this is the important hierarchy of this piece, and this bit's crap. We don't care about the way we package. the tape was all done. And from that moment on, I've tried to make the object of painting beautiful. So this piece is started on the floor. So I think about every single moment of a painting, from the raw canvas all the way through to the way that I put it in a frame. And this starts on the floor, and I drip this very thin, either with acrylic or with oil. And it's like a sort of ultramarine or an alizarin crimson and black, very, very thin with terps, this one. And I drip it like it's rain. So it gives it a sense of gravity right behind the whole image. See, it's very subtle and you don't really see it, but it sets an emotional tone to the work. And then, so that was how I started it. And then I started to build, the format of the piece. I made stencils. I used pastels. After I saw John Elderfield's MoMA show, and I saw the de Kooning show, I saw how important pastels were to de Kooning's Woman 1 series. And I realized that to draw in pastels, you can draw and rub it out, rub it out, can erase, and build up again. And it never, ever gets clogged up, which was often a problem in my painting, that I couldn't move the paint because the paint had got so kind of porridge-like, I call it, because it gets kind of lumpy. And so I started working a lot more in pastels because it gave me the freedom to really layer up. So I'd done those mother pieces, I'd done the drawings of mother and child, and used transparency of drawing to have forms inside of forms, to get this sense of time, of mystery, of hidden time. And the pastels gave me this terrific halfway house between painting and drawing with, outline, like more contour drawing. And
compass is more to what you're talking about.
It's the same idea of this very, like a sculptural mass. I mean, those bodies couldn't exist like that in real life. But I want a feeling that has a feeling of inevitability. So when I read really good poetry, I get a sort of shock of recognition of the words that I'm reading. Even though I've never read those words like that before, I feel a sense that I've landed on words that, it's not that they're written for you, but you have this sort of, the shock of recognition is the only way I can describe it. And I work trying to get the same thing, where it has an inevitability. It was meant to look like this. And I don't know what else to do to it. I don't know what other forms to add to it. And it takes a long time to get those collective limbs to work together so that they feel like they're a human mass that's supposed to be like that. And I think when I look back, the difference was before I was making singular works. So, the intersex works that I've made that were to do with moving gender. I think I moved from finding a model that was gender non-specific, as it were, or had a fluidity of gender, to the actual work having a fluidity of gender, so that the piece itself moved around in gender rather than the body that I was depicting. So I took that as a model of a way to make work where you moved in between genders or sexualities or body types that were from different kind of sexualities and all meshed together created a kind of human body. And I read in Plato's Symposium, there's this debate about love. And this piece is called 1 out of 2 Symposium, where he's describing how the god Zeus, actually, the human body was male body on one side, female body on another side, and was split by Zeus, so that forever you'd have this sense of longing that these bodies would try to find each other. And I kind of thought about that, about gender, that whether you had this, what is a sense of wholeness, or what is like a normal body that we see as a normal body? What if you have this kind of mass coming together? And so this piece came out of that. It was really difficult. I hope it doesn't look difficult. I hope it looks complete, because it's meant to look very, very sculptural and have that tension of movement. And within it, there's, if you see those big white areas and look on the side, there's actually a whole body lying this way. And then I started to, horizontally, I started to make these stencils with plastic. I cut out plastic stencils of bodies, all pieces of paper, and then I embed them and then draw over the top in a contradictory way, which I got from de Kooning. If you look at de Kooning, the way he grows space is he will put flat areas of colour over forms, And that flat area of colour acts as a resistance to looking, and then he builds the form again. And he does that in an abstract way, and I took that into figuration. So I was able to build another section of form, of legs or arms or whatever it is, off the contradiction of the image that had gone before, which is really difficult, because you have to change your thinking and stop analysing the body that's underneath, and it slowly embeds itself. And what you get is surprising forms that are human, but are not necessarily descriptive of one particular body. And you start to create a human mass, or a human, it's a human mass is the way I can describe it. That's what I search for, this human mass that has a realism beyond the realism of just having one body or two bodies lying there. The mass itself creates more reality than just a regular painting of bodies.
So we're quite short on time.
Okay.
But if you'll allow me just one last question.
Yeah.
I mean, we're living in this realm where figurative painting is taken hold really worldwide. And there's this, of course, focus on identity politics and the saturation of color palette. What do you feel makes figurative painting successful today? In simple terms,
well,
if we can.
I mean, the amount of times I've heard figurative painting's back, figurative painting's dead, I had this quote once from ancient Greece of people debating painting being dead. And I thought it's the greatest thing I've ever read.
Yeah, I mean,
because painting's been dead how many times?
How many times?
Right, it's constantly dying, and then it's constantly coming back, and then and then auctions will say it's back because they want to sell a lot of figurative paintings, and then so it goes like that, and I don't. The whole of, if you look at human history, the figure has been there so many times, it's never going away, right? It's one of the problems I encountered in making figurative paintings is it's really hard to get good at it, right? So I'm not saying abstract painting's easier, and just that if you want to, it's a long game, because I didn't want to. There was a kind of movement where bad figurative painting became good painting. And I didn't want to be part of that. I found that I wanted to know how that wrist works, or I wanted to know how that ankle works, because that gave me freedom. Because I can make it broken, or I can make it the way it is. And I loved Picasso, and Picasso was able to be radical and be very good and be very technical. And I made a sort of pact with myself a while ago that I wanted to be as versatile as I possibly could. And I have a separate drawing studio to my painting studio. So, and that gave me this sort of much more freedom to experiment. But in terms of figuration in general, I think there's always figurative painters. I just think that we don't necessarily see them sometimes, and it depends who's painting at any particular time. I mean, abstract painting has been exceptionally good in America. I mean, America is the home of abstraction.
It is.
I'm so grateful to that, because I've learned more from abstract painting of the time I live than I have from figurative painting. The figurative painting I look at is very old painting by and large. So if you want to be a figurative painter, I think it's it's apart from the only person that was able to do it without being knowing everything was Francis Bacon. Because had Francis Bacon been able to paint the hands on the Pope, he wouldn't have done the Screaming Pope. He had to find a language, because he couldn't paint like Velázquez. He couldn't paint the hands sitting nicely like that. And if he could have, it just would have been awful. So he was able to use his skill to make screening, or like pulling the paint, or folding form on top of each other, as a way to access emotion that he couldn't through doing academic means. And so he's the person, it's impossible to take from Bacon, because he makes this language that's just utterly of his own. That's why I admire him so deeply, because of that.
I think it's the perfect place to end our talk. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jenny.